Let's talk about that from an insulin resistance perspective, where over time that cell becomes resistant to insulin. The body starts making more, trying to get that glucose into the cell, and how this is at the heart of metabolic issues, which are such a problem in today's health world.
So think about, like, dive into your cell with me for a second. What happens every time we eat a high carbohydrate meal, or every time we eat a high sugar or a bad fat meal? What ends up happening is your body registers there's this massive increase in glucose, and the pancreas has to all of a sudden create a ton of insulin. Insulin is the hormone that escorts glucose into the cell. Glucose can't get into the cell without the help of insulin. So now you have all this glucose from the food you ate. You have all of the insulin that has been produced because your body registered it. And all of that is rushing to the cell. And insulin's trying to shove glucose into the cell, but there's only a little tiny spot and little receptor sites for it to get it in there. And then on top of that, now you're eating a lot of bad oils, and the bad oils have that outer part of the cell really inflamed. And maybe you're eating a lot of toxins, because toxins are allowed, chemicals are allowed in our food system right now. And those chemicals are blocking these receptor sites. So the outer part of the cell is like, 6 o'clock rush hour in Manhattan. Like, it's just jammed up with too much glucose, too much insulin, too many bad fats, too many chemicals, and nothing is getting into the cell. So your body is so intelligent that what it decides is, I can't get all this stuff into the cell. So what I'm going to do is I need to go store it somewhere. So in order to save your life, it doesn't immediately think to store it around your internal organs. It'll decide to store it in fat. And the fat it's going to store it in is going to be around your belly, back of your arms, your booty, your face. It'll even store it in the fat in your brain. It just starts to sock it away in fat, because it knows if it puts it in fat, it won't kill you. Whereas if it put it around your heart and lungs, then it would kill you. So this insulin resistance is multifactorial, but this is the crux of the human health problem right now. And I know there's so many people talking about this. Like, we have got to bring back insulin sensitivity. And it starts by understanding how this traffic jam is happening and what the consequence of that is. And that, again, this is why I think fasting works so well, is because it gave people a break, and the cell was like, okay, nothing's coming in for a moment. I can start to bring down some inflammation. I can let some things in. It stopped the traffic jam, the cellular traffic jam, from happening.
I want to highlight something that underlied what you brought up there, the fact that the body is doing this in a way to help you, where it has insulin resistance starting, nowhere to put this glucose, and it's trying to protect you by storing it in different areas of the body. And like you mentioned, it's going to put them in the least harmful areas first. So a lot of times people probably demonize their body for, putting on weight, becoming fat, looking in the mirror and feeling bad about themselves. But this is your body, a warning sign from your body, and your body trying to help you.
That's right. I'm so happy you brought this up, because I have been trying to scream this from the rooftops. What happens when we look in the mirror? And this happens, to both men and women, but a lot to women. We look in the mirror, we see the fat we don't like. And then we start to talk poorly to ourselves. Like, I wasn't able to follow a diet. I'm never going to be thin. It must be in my genetics. Like, you start the hatred, the guilt, the shame that happens just by what we see in the mirror looking back at us. But in reality, your brilliant body decided that it had too much of something. It had too much glucose, it had too many hormones, and it had too many toxins. And it had to make a decision in that moment if it was going to put that in an area that would kill you, like your heart and lungs, or put it around your belly that might not be aesthetically pleasing, but would save your life. And it chose to put it in an area that would save your life. And yet we villainize it, we shame ourselves around it, and your body was doing absolutely the right thing in order for you to survive. So I personally think we should look at our fat and be like, thank you, body. Thank you for storing it somewhere else. Now let's work together to release that storage, which is really, where Fast Like a Girl and even Eat Like a Girl will do, is just help women understand how you can release all that storage. But the first thing you got to do is forgive yourself. You got to understand the body was doing the most perfect thing given the condition that the environment in which it was exposed to.
It was just responding to the inputs you gave it. And likely you were trying your best with the information you had.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it wasn't the right information. And that's why we're going to do our best today to cover what people need to do, give it the right inputs so people can start to shed that weight. And it's beyond a cosmetic issue. This has to do with your metabolic health and preventing chronic disease. So there's always that piece of this argument that tends to focus on, I'm comfortable in my body. I don't mind having the extra weight. Well, that's one aspect to it. And that part is very gray and hard to argue. But there are health complications when you're metabolically unhealthy and when you have that extra weight that we can't deny.
That's right. That's an interesting one. I'm so happy you bring it up, because I first off want to say the goal of metabolic health is not for us all to look the same. The analogy or the story I always say is, I remember going to the Olympic Museum in Lake Geneva, Switzerland, and there's this picture on the wall of all the different gold medal athletes in all the different sports. And they had one for men and they had one for women. I, of course, looked at the woman one. And when I looked at that, I was like, here are 25, 30 gold medal athletes, and their body types could not be any more different. So I'm not advocating for us all to be super thin. I'm advocating for us to love living in our body. And then B, you just said it. What does your blood work look like? And I personally like make sure that, if you're carrying 5, 10, 20 extra pounds, what does your blood work look like? Is it showing that you are healthy? And I have found that most of the time it's not. I've found a rare few people that are, overweight, carrying extra weight, and have amazing blood work. It's not always, those two don't go together always. Now, if you want to dial it down even more, the most important piece of the blood work that you need to look at is your hemoglobin A1C. That tells you what your glucose and insulin system has been doing for 90 days. That needs to be around 5. I can tell you, in my community, we have a lot of people when they first come into my Reset Academy, where we're teaching them different fasts and different ways of eating. People will just say, I'm 5.5, I'm 5.6. In this healthcare system, that's considered not perfect, obviously, but it's okay. You might be a little pre-diabetic. But if we all just followed that one number, stop following the number on the scale, stop following the BMI, that doesn't matter. Follow hemoglobin A1C and get that number around 5. And then look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, do I love living in this body? If you love living in this body, that hemoglobin A1C is close to 5. Now we're in a body that is functioning the way it's supposed to function. But that's not what's happening. What most people will do is they'll carry extra weight and then they'll be like, it's okay, I'm fine. I like being this way. Well, let's make sure A, that statement's completely accurate. And that's fine. If it's completely accurate, great. And then B, let's make sure your blood work, especially hemoglobin A1C, is in the right spot.
Isn't it true hemoglobin A1C is looking at glycation of red blood cells?
Yeah. Yes.
So to me, wouldn't it be one step better to look at fasting insulin? Because insulin, the way I understand it, can be deceptive have deception covering that number, because if it's jamming the glucose into cells and insulin's rising over time, your hemoglobin A1C can still remain more normal while your insulin is climbing and you're becoming insulin resistant. Is there
So
truth to that, the way you see it?
I like a longer picture. So the reason I like hemoglobin A1C is it tells me what that metabolic system's been doing for 90 days. When I've sent patients to blood work and we look at their fasting insulin, you're just getting a snapshot of that day. You're not necessarily getting this long-term picture. So I like hemoglobin A1C for the long vision. Second thing, I want to bring up the glycation thing because this is massively important and it ties into the mitochondrial needs. So glycation is an indicator of how many glucose molecules are gummed up on a red blood cell. That red blood cell is carrying oxygen to your tissues. If hemoglobin A1C is really high, it means that you're not getting glucose into your cells for use, and it's sticking on the outside of these red blood cells, which is impacting oxygen and how much oxygen can be delivered to the tissues, which ultimately tissues that don't have oxygen in them, the mitochondria is not going to be stimulated, and that tissue will die. So I like hemoglobin A1C because it has this long-term vision, plus it tells us functionality. Why is there extra glucose around your red blood cells? Why is it there? Well, the reason it's there is because it can't get into the cell. Insulin's having trouble getting it into the cells. And so what ends up happening is it's flooding in the system and being stored elsewhere.
Okay. Maybe the ideal is to have both, because,
Oh, yeah.
again, coming back to the way I see it is early on when insulin is rising, like the earliest stages of insulin resistance, you're going to be jamming that glucose out of the bloodstream. So your hemoglobin A1C won't be going up because insulin's artificially bringing that glucose down. And you can see the picture earlier on by looking at fasting insulin. Once it can't jam that glucose into the cell, blood glucose raises, then hemoglobin A1C is going to rise. So again, I think there's different value in both those numbers, but just wanted to round out that explanation.
Yeah, so you're right. I'm not saying don't look at the other numbers. I'm just trying to make things really simple for people. So let's use your scenario as an example. You walk into your doctor's office and they do a blood work on you and they find your insulin is really high. The next question is, how long has it been high? How much damage has it done? Well, if insulin's high, then we know glucose is high. So now let's go to hemoglobin A1C. Oh, over the last 90 days, it's been pretty high. This isn't a today problem. This is a problem from the last several months. So again, you can use both of them, but I think the hemoglobin A1C lets you know how long this has been going on and what is the consequence that's going to happen. So they're both very much helpful. I just have found hemoglobin A1C to be the most motivating when we're trying to make change.
Have you heard of the Kraft test?
No, I haven't.
That's where you take in a bolus of glucose, I believe, and I'm just paraphrasing the way I understand it, and then you look at insulin over a period of time. So you're doing it's better even than a fasting insulin, where you're in the doctor's office having that bolus of glucose and then looking at insulin over a number of hours and how the body responds to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, love the idea. Let's make it easy. I'm like all about, we've got a metabolic mess in the world. It's incredibly horrible in the United States. How are we going to motivate people? How are we going to make this simple for people so people can get out of the metabolic mess that they're in? And so, yeah, if you want to look at insulin, great. If you want to look at hemoglobin A1C, now we've nuanced that. If you want to do the Kraft test, all of that could be interesting. But how are we going to make this easy for the single mom who's working 2 jobs and can barely figure out time to put some food in her mouth? Like, that's the person I want to try to reach, is how do we help her?
For that person, somebody who doesn't have the time or resources right now to even go to the doctor and have anything assessed, what do you feel is the best assessment to do at home to see where you're at on that spectrum of insulin resistance all the way to type 2 diabetes?
Oh, it's a great question. I think the first question is, can you go without food? The first sign of mitochondrial dysfunction is when you can't go more than a couple hours without food. So really important to understand your hunger habits. In fact, all the weight loss drugs, it's like, that is a sign of the metabolic mess we're in that didn't just randomly happen. We have all these toxic foods that came into our system that threw off our metabolic health, and now we've come up with drugs to kill the hunger. But without to start with, can you go without food? If you can't go without food, we've got some mitochondrial distress here. So that's really the first one. The second one that I think, if for people who don't have money or don't have time, is to think about, am I energized after food? If I'm not energized after food, if I'm sleepy, there's a good chance that glucose couldn't get into the cell. And so all of a sudden now it's swimming in your body, and it's going maybe up into your brain. It's causing a little bit of brain fog. Like, you should, when you eat, your cells should grab that glucose, pass it into the outer membrane of the cell, give it to the mitochondria, and the mitochondria should be like, yes. And then all of a sudden it gives you ATP. But that if you're eating and then you're sleepy, or if you're eating and then a couple of hours later you're like, I'm hangry, I need to eat again, then we've got a metabolic challenge. And then the other one that I even like, if we want to get even more nuanced, is women going through perimenopause and menopause. The brain becomes less and less sensitive to glucose through that menopause experience. So if you've got brain fog, consistent brain fog, my question is, like, what's your hemoglobin A1C? What's going on with your fasting glucose? Get a handheld monitor or a CGM and understand what's going on, because your body is becoming inefficient at using glucose, so the brain fog continues to be worse. So we can use symptoms, we can use blood tests, we can use some of these the things, the biometric wearables and things that are available to us. But ultimately, ask yourself if you can go without food. If you can't go without food, we have the beginning of a metabolic challenge that you're going to want to take care of.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
If you're feeling more confused than ever, then let's just come back to some basic principles, like these 5 foundational food ideas and learning how to fast. And you will see so much change in your